When we hear the word empire, most of us imagine armies on the march, great battles, and maps painted in bold imperial colors. But in the 20th century, a very different kind of empire emerged. One that didn't need soldiers. Just signatures. There were no troops marching into cities. Instead, there were men in tailored suits boarding planes, carrying loan agreements in their briefcases. And nowhere was this quiet, shadow empire more visible than in Latin America. Here, the International Monetary Fund didn't simply lend money. It rewrote entire economies. It dictated national policies. And it quietly reshaped the lives of hundreds of millions of people. All of it, we were told, was done in the name of stability. And all of it served one group above all others, the creditors. The irony is hard to miss. The IMF was born in 1944, at Bretton Woods, in the aftermath of global war. Its mission sounded noble: stabilize currencies, prevent economic collapse, help nations rebuild from devastation. It was supposed to be the doctor of the global economy. Calm the panic. Heal the patient. Give struggling countries another chance. But in Latin America, that doctor slowly became something else. Less healer, more debt collector. Its real job became making sure banks in New York and London got paid, no matter what it cost the patient lying on the table. To understand how this happened, we have to step back in time. Long before the IMF arrived, countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina were trying to modernize as fast as they could. They built factories behind tariff walls. They expanded state-owned companies. They subsidized food and fuel to keep society stable. Politicians promised growth today, and paid for it with borrowed money tomorrow. And tomorrow's bill was enormous. Then came the 1970s. Cheap money flooded the global system. Oil prices exploded. Petrodollars piled up in Western banks, and those banks were desperate to lend. Latin American leaders saw an opportunity. Borrow dollars. Build roads, dams, factories, railways. Fund social programs. Keep voters happy. Keep the political machine running. For a while, it felt like a miracle. Growth was strong. Leaders were popular. The future looked bright. But there was always a catch. That catch arrived in the early 1980s. In the United States, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker raised interest rates to extreme levels to crush inflation. Almost overnight, Latin America's cheap loans turned into crushing debts. Loans that once charged 5% interest suddenly demanded 15, or even 20%. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, one by one, they realized they couldn't pay. In 1982, Mexico's finance minister went to Washington and said the unthinkable. We can't pay our debt. It was the financial equivalent of declaring bankruptcy. And the IMF was already waiting. The help came with conditions. Subsidies on food and fuel had to go. Currencies had to be devalued. Wages frozen. Industries privatized. Spending on health, education, and pensions slashed. In exchange for emergency loans, entire national budgets were rewritten, not in Mexico City or Buenos Aires, but in quiet offices in Washington, D.C. And those new budgets had one overriding goal: make sure the banks got their money back. For politicians, the IMF was convenient. It became a shield. When people protested, leaders could say, "We have no choice. The IMF demands it." The pain was pushed onto ordinary citizens. Bread became more expensive. Public workers lost their jobs. Schools lost funding. But foreign creditors slept well. Latin America had become a laboratory for austerity. And its people were the test subjects. The consequences were devastating. Between 1980 and 1990, income per person across the region fell. Entire countries became poorer, even as billions of dollars flowed outward in debt payments. Economists gave it a name: the lost decade. Growth stalled. Inequality widened. Poverty exploded. And yet, the debt never disappeared. It clung on like a weight dragging a drowning man deeper, even as he was forced to hand over his wallet. This wasn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It was riots in Caracas when fuel subsidies vanished overnight. It was protests in Buenos Aires when wages froze but prices soared. It was hunger, unemployment, and fear. In some places, governments collapsed. In others, authoritarian regimes used IMF-backed austerity as an excuse for repression. Through it all, the IMF insisted it was neutral, technocratic, rational. But it wasn't neutral. It existed to enforce repayment, to protect the financial system, to ensure money and power flowed upward. Mexico was only the first domino in 1982. Once it fell, the rest followed. Banks in New York, London, and Frankfurt suddenly faced a terrifying possibility. They might not get paid. The IMF stepped in, not just to save countries, but to stabilize the global banking system itself. The deal was always the same. New loans, but only if governments cut spending, sold public assets, and opened their economies. This approach became known as the Washington Consensus, and it shaped Latin America for decades. On paper, it promised efficiency and competitiveness. In reality, it tore apart social safety nets and shifted wealth from the public to private hands, often foreign ones. Bolivia became the textbook example. In 1985, inflation was so extreme that prices rose thousands of percent in a single year. The solution was shock therapy. Subsidies were eliminated overnight. The currency collapsed. Public spending was gutted. Inflation fell, but so did livelihoods. Mines closed. Jobs vanished. Entire communities were abandoned. Argentina tells an even darker story. In the 1990s, it followed IMF advice faithfully. Peg the currency to the dollar. Privatize everything. Cut deficits. For a while, it looked like a success. Investors poured in. Politicians boasted. Then, in 2001, it all fell apart. Banks froze accounts. People lost their savings overnight. Riots shook Buenos Aires. Crowds chanted, "Que se vayan todos!" Throw them all out. The IMF left, its reputation shattered. And the pattern repeated. Brazil, Peru, and others stabilized inflation but paid with long-term inequality and social damage. Again and again, the result was the same: security for creditors, stagnation for citizens. Why did politicians go along with it? Because the IMF made it easier. Leaders could enjoy the good times and blame outsiders when the pain arrived. It's not our choice, they said. It's the IMF. That's why the 1980s remained Latin America's lost decade. Growth vanished. Poverty soared. Education and infrastructure crumbled. And yet, hundreds of billions flowed outward to creditors. Here's the most unsettling part. Latin America wasn't the exception. It was the experiment. The policies tested there later reappeared in Asia, in Russia, and in Greece after 2008. Which raises a hard question: was this really about economics? Or about protecting a global system designed to serve creditors first? This story isn't just history. It's a warning. Because today, many rich countries carry debt levels that would have terrified Latin American leaders decades ago. As long as markets believe those debts can be paid, everything seems fine. But belief can vanish overnight. Debt isn't just money. It's power. Latin America's lost decade showed how the system really works, and who pays the price. If you recognize the pattern, you don't have to be its victim. Don't confuse promises with real wealth. Real wealth is resilience. Skills that can't be erased. Assets that don't vanish overnight. Relationships no system can privatize. History may not repeat itself. But if you ignore it, it has a cruel way of teaching the same lesson again. If this story gave you a new perspective, subscribe. History hides the answers. I'll help you find them.